Okay, and the question was asked if I would say something about notions of self in relation to trauma. And in fact, there's a lot to say, and I will say just a little bit about it. When I taught this course in previous years, things were structured a little bit differently, so that I focused on post-traumatic stress disorder in the second part of the lectures. But since there's a separate course now, Lawrence said, no double teaching where you give the same lecture twice. I said, okay, Lawrence. I said, I won't even mention PTSD for these two, but I am going to mention it. Because the question came up quite naturally, and something I did not discuss in Duncan Peterson's course, on trauma and the self. And there's a huge literature on this, and the literature does not begin with PTSD, but goes all the way back to Genet, who was very interested in and Genet wrote about trauma and traumatic experiences and so on. And of course, Freud likewise. And so there's been an interest in the relationship between trauma and self, however we define self, but particularly in terms of self-awareness, self-identity, in all the terms that I gave, forensic self and so on. So what I would like to do is just to discuss three issues here that I think are that are of particular interest or warrant interest in terms of discussions of self and trauma, and particularly in relationship after 1980 to post-traumatic stress disorder. The first of these issues or subjects is what is called ontological security. And of course, ontological meaning our sense of reality and what is real in the world. Now, this term ontological security is not my term. It comes from R.D. Laing. Remember I mentioned one of the, perhaps the most famous psychiatrists in the anti-psychiatry movement, and who wrote several books, very, very influential, very important books in the 1970s and 1980s. And the most impressive of the books was one titled The Divided Self. And The Divided Self was about schizophrenia, as you might intuit, was about schizophrenia. But this was pre-DSM-3, pre-Kraepelinian. And Laing made based upon clinical vignettes of his own patients, an argument that schizophrenia and the symptoms of schizophrenia and the kind of subjectivity and self-awareness associated with schizophrenia and a very odd kind of distorted self associated with schizophrenia represents an adaptation to extreme stressors. He does not use the word stressor, I'm using, but extreme conflicts, often embedded within the family and so on. And that the symptoms are an effort of the patient to adapt to it, and one of those efforts involves the splitting of the self. And again, what the challenge is a challenge of ontological security, that the individual is placed in a situation, particularly if we look at the onset of schizophrenia in late adolescence, early adulthood, where the maturation of the self is reaching its apotheosis, the point where it finally comes together. We know the brain likewise at this time. So he says that individuals at this period and younger are extremely vulnerable, and that the sense of ontological insecurity is unbearable. Because the world becomes a world that is derealized. It's no longer part of reality. Okay, it's ideas, I'm sure, that you're familiar with it. Excuse me. This idea of the divided self was then reflected in a wonderful book written by another psychiatrist. One, I think, much more important than R.D. Laing, who really perpetrated some real mischief later when he founded a kind of, what he called an Institute for the Treatment of Schizophrenia that was really, had very bad results. In any event, but the book that I'm referring to, also in the same notion of the divided self and trauma and the divided self, is by Robert Jay Lifton, L-I-F-T-O-N, a very senior American psychiatrist. And Lifton had previously written several books to the one that I'm going to describe. One was about the survivors of Hiroshima. And by survivors, not just survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, but very often survivors of families, the only ones who were left, who survived, and often individuals who were horribly scarred by the bomb and so on, so had multiple traumas, the trauma of the bomb, the trauma of the burning through a radiation sickness, loss of members of their families, and so on. And he wrote a book about these individuals, as I recall, mainly women, and based upon his own research in Japan. He had come to Japan as a young psychiatrist in the American Armed Forces and had become interested in this question about the survivors. But the book about the divided self is not about these. Well, we also wrote a book about Vietnam veterans coming home from the war. And he was very interested in that book and writing about it because many of the veterans who came back had what was later diagnosed as PTSD. But at that point, the diagnosis did not exist. And Lifton was one of the members, maybe the most influential member of the DSM-3 committee to invent or construct PTSD, and was much of it was predicated on his research in Japan, his research with regards to with the Vietnam veterans, and what he learned from his interviews with the veterans. He became part of actually a movement called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a political movement, together with someone originally from McGill, a famous psychiatrist, Chaim Shatin, who was also on the committee. So he was very involved with this. He knew the soldiers very well, had had lots of contacts with them, clinical contacts and so on with them. And one theme that was a recurrent theme in talking to men who had had traumatic experiences and would later qualify for what became PTSD was their participation in atrocities, which was a very conspicuous feature of the Vietnam War from the American side. Lots and lots of atrocities, and these were men who were traumatized not by atrocities perpetrated on them, being tortured, and that certainly happened. Lots of atrocities perpetrated by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, but most of the patients who reported atrocities were individuals who participated in atrocities or were the passive witnesses to atrocities being perpetrated by their comrades, by other American soldiers. And what Lifton was interested in was the impact of participating in atrocities on what we would call the self, and the kinds of adaptations that are made. So it's not simply trauma, but it is trauma in which there is violence, but in which it is the perpetrator who is traumatized by his own violence. And I wrote an article, I don't know if I asked you to read it for the other course, called The Self-Traumatized Perpetrator. Because coming from the Vietnam War, lots of other examples, and in my own research in psychiatric inpatient unit was again a dominant theme of atrocities committed by the patients themselves. So they had been traumatized, but been traumatized by the violence that they had inflicted on others, or at least that's what they claimed that had happened. But it's the third book that's the most interesting in this respect, having to do with the impact of trauma on the self. And I think it'll be interesting to you too. And the title of the book is The Nazi Doctors. And The Nazi Doctors is a monograph on German physicians who worked in extermination camps and concentration camps. They had physicians doing various things. The most notorious of all that we know in terms of name would be Mengele, but Mengele was one of many physicians, and physicians doing terrible, terrible things, and participating in the extermination of children and adults and so on and so forth, and often participating in the case of mentally ill individuals in Germany in the actual killing of themselves by the physicians. And Lifton asked the question, this seems almost inconceivable that physicians would participate in torturing and murdering people. And he says, but I want to look at this dispassionately through the eyes of a psychiatrist. And I want to ask, what is the effect upon the self of this kind of participation? So he has like an introduction to this with soldiers who have committed atrocities. Now he wants to ask about the German doctors. And he has a theory about the soldiers. His theory about the soldiers who commit atrocities is that they're not morally culpable. And they're not morally culpable because they were put in a situation that he describes as the atrocity-producing situation, where the circumstances, the environment coalesced to make the commission of atrocities inevitable. Well, I don't think he's right empirically, but you can see what his argument is. But he says, contrast this with the Nazi doctors. These men were physicians. They were not 19-year-old uneducated boys. They were people going through medical school, had taken the Hippocratic Oath, had families of their own, and in addition to that, had volunteered for everything. They had volunteered to become members of the SS, and within the SS they had volunteered to become physicians at concentration camps and extermination camps. And Lifton says, how is this possible? How can everything that we know about the self and self-awareness explain this? Particularly when we know that these men were not monsters before they went to the concentration camps and extermination camps. And when they returned, they had no problem being reabsorbed into everyday life, rejoining their families, essentially untouched by the experiences that they had, returning eventually to medical associations, universities as physicians. And Lifton, again, says at first, this would seem inconceivable that a person could do this. what is interesting about, amongst other things, about Lifton's account, as with his other books, it's not a distant account. It's not, he's not relying on secondary sources. He's relying on interviews with the Nazi doctors. And he arranges for a substantial number of these, where he does the interview, some in which people do the interview for him because there's a problem. Not only is he an American, but he's a Jew, and you can imagine some people, Nazi doctors, be a little uncomfortable, and are particularly uncomfortable because of their culpability, that they'll end up being sent to prison or being tried. Lifton says, no, you don't have to worry, I guarantee that. In any event, so my point is that the book is interesting because it's based on empirical research by Lifton, not secondary sources, not at a distance. And he comes to an extraordinary conclusion. And the conclusion is very similar to R.D. Laing's conclusion about the impact of trauma on the self and the adaptation of the self to the trauma and to the conflict. And he makes the argument that there is a splitting that took place between within the self amongst these men. And that on one side of the split was the normal self. That is to say, the individual who had a family, who had treated people, had been a caring physician, at least in some cases, and who then returned to society. And that on the other side of the self, of this division, was the self, the soldier who did his job, and who was often a Nazi ideologue in terms of seeing the world being transformed, a hatred for Jews, and blah, blah, you know, the whole story with regards to it. Now, he bases his argument not so much on R.D. Laing, who's not so important, as on Genet, Pierre Genet, because Genet had come to the same conclusion about the patients that he was treating, and those patients, ones that Genet were treating, were almost all women. Many of them were young women. They were not involved in any atrocity at all, but they had been subjected to trauma. And Genet's argument was that one adaptation that these women were making to their traumatic experiences was likewise a kind of a splitting of the self, but into dual personalities. And this was multiple personality, and then this by the 1990s became a kind of an industry within one branch of psychiatry of multiple personality disorder. I had an involvement in this, and really quite interesting. In any event, Lifton's argument was, again, that there was this splitting that took place, and the splitting was essentially a defensive splitting. That's conclusion number one. It's the second conclusion that is the most remarkable. And he says, when you ask the question, how could a doctor do this? He said, you've got everything backwards. I'm a doctor, and I'm going to tell you how a doctor could do this. That what they were doing was something that all doctors have got to do in one way or another to be a physician. And that is to engage continually with suffering and unhappiness and misery and inflicting pain on people, therapeutic pain on people. There's got to be some kind of splitting that takes place. And part of the socialization of physicians, of good physicians, is this kind of splitting, not the kind of the Nazi doctors. But what happened to the Nazi doctors was a transmogrification, a kind of magnification of something that was already there in the professional self as a result of the socialization of physicians. And indeed, here at McGill, at every medical, not everybody can do this, can go through the 5 years of medical undergraduate training and come out as clinicians precisely because they're incapable of the sort of splitting and dispassionate compassion that is necessary. And often they don't go on to become clinicians, don't do residencies, become historians or whatever they want to do. So Lifton's account is really a very interesting one of this kind of a divided self as an adaptation to the conflict, makes sense with regards to these individuals and so on. The idea of ontological security is different, however. The Lifton's notion is that if there were not a divided self, there would be so many contradictions in the lives of the Nazi doctors that it would be unbearable. The world would become chaotic for them, that there would be no way to organize the self in a way that is meaningful, that would retain the notion of moral accountability by which individuals identify themselves. Not moral accountability of Nazi doctors towards Jews or gypsies or homosexuals, but of moral accountability to one's children, to one's parents, to one's spouse, and so on, to one's nation, and so on. So we become unbearable, we just become chaotic. It is that theme of ontological security, insecurity, of not being able to find some kind of adjustment that pervades much of the PTSD literature, particularly from the 1980s and 1990s, that there is a fundamental disintegration of the ontological foundations of the self, of being a part of the world. That characterizes PTSD. So that's one theme, and I don't have time to talk about, but it is an important, and it's got many strands, and one looks at the clinical literature, and likewise today. For example, the disappearance of safety, a sense of safety. And all of us have got at least some, here, thank God, we live in a society, we have a good sense of safety. We don't have to worry when we meet someone comes through the door that is going to threaten our lives. As you can imagine, being in a world like that, where one cannot anticipate that kind of safety, what impact that would have on ontological security. So that when I came to do my research in the PTSD unit and the inpatient unit, I was really quite surprised that there were many imperatives, but the top imperative before you walk through the door that you were forsworn to, and everyone there was, including all the patients, was the notion of safety. That this, you walk through the door, this is a secure environment, that you don't have to worry about anything happening. Could be some violent talk, but you don't have to worry about physical violence at all. This is a zone that is completely safe. And I was quite surprised in the unit. There were some patients who were, seemed to me, and from the clinician's point of view, very sympathetic individuals for whom one would have to be made of stone not to feel compassion for them, who for one reason or another on some occasion will become very angry and would get into a physical confrontation with another patient. They were out within 1 hour. They were just taken unceremoniously, taken by one of the psychiatrists into the room that they shared with 1 or 2 other men. They were watched as they packed everything out, and they were taken down the stairs, and they left, and they could reapply in 6 months for readmission. And I thought, my God, this is so draconian to do this. You know, you can explain to the guy, you do it again, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of the clinical philosophy, it made perfectly good sense. And that is only in an environment that is one that is entirely safe and that there's no concern about safety, that the therapeutic process can take place. and contrasting this with what was believed to be the state of the self, the state of the self not having ontological security. Another loss of ontological security for these men that was regarded was the fact that many of them had a very common complaint was that they were survivors in the sense that the Hiroshima victims were survivors. Not only had they survived traumas, but they were the only ones left alive of a small group of people who were closely related. Not related in terms of kinship, but in terms of friendship. And the question that many of them had, of men who had that experience and that Lifton wrote much about, was the question, and when he wrote later about concentration camp survivors, the same question. Why did I survive? Why was it me rather than these other people who died? And the question is a way of asserting that the world is now essentially meaningless. There is no meaning in the world. There's no answer to that question. And again, challenging the notion of ontological security upon which not only a healthy self, any sort of self is possible. The final assault on, when we talk about trauma, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, and ontological security and the sense of the self has to do with time. Now remember, if we go back to the tradition, it begins with John Locke and carries on now. If in fact Locke was right, and Hume was right, and Ribot and everyone else was right, and that when you wake up in the morning, you're the same person, because it has to do with memory and so on, the continuity of memory. Imagine a world in which memory, which flows in a single direction, no longer flows in a single direction, in which somehow promiscuously, mischievously, time is being mixed up all the time. And the most conspicuous feature of this, and this, at least construction of it within PTSD, is the notion of the flashback. That the flashback occurs, and ostensibly the individual believes that he's back in the past. And the argument is, well, this is profoundly disconcerting, undermining a sense of time flowing in a single direction, if in fact the past is not kept in the past, but is continuously intruding in the present. Again, you can see this issue of ontological security becomes very important. Okay, number two with regards to the self, answering this question of the self. If you look at post-traumatic stress disorder, you see that the foundation consists of a core of 4 features, diagnostic criteria. There's the traumatic event, there's the traumatic memory, it's the memory that drives the syndrome, and the syndrome consists of avoidance, of numbing, and then in addition of autonomic arousal associated with a survival response. This is the official, and this is the way that we understand PTSD. But there's another way to understand it. It is much simpler and really quite accurate. And that is that PTSD consists of a traumatic memory, an underlying conflict, and a syndrome that is an adaptation to that memory. So that everything after diagnostic criterion B, which is the recurrent memory, the avoidance, the numbing, the autonomic arousal, are not simply symptoms, but they represent an adaptation. And this is a classic definition of what a neurosis is, and that's how PTSD starts off as a traumatic neurosis. Now, the argument is made that that adaptation, as with all neuroses, represents a distortion of the self. So the self is being distorted not directly by the impact of the trauma on the self, which is ontological insecurity, but rather through the adaptation to the trauma, to the memory, to the traumatic memory. So there's ontological insecurity can result in things like splitting, but splitting would be exactly this, would be a distortion of the self, avoidance and numbing and so on, and so forth. And so that is another way in which trauma impacts. If we look at the literature where people have written about, they write about that too. There is a third way, and the third way is the easiest to explain, probably the least interesting for you, but good if you reflect back what I was saying about Locke's exchange with the French philosopher about getting drunk and committing crimes. And it has to do with flashbacks. During the 1980s, there were a number of criminal cases tried in the United States of men committing, Vietnam veterans, committing felonies. Sometimes these were robberies, sometimes they involved murders, including often murders of family members, wives, so on, in which the defense was made that these men were in the middle of a flashback. And so that what they were enacting was behavior completely appropriate to the traumatic situation, but inappropriate to the one that they were in. And therefore their culpability, their guilt would be at the very least mitigated, because they were not the same person. They were someone living in the past, the self in the past that is now inhabiting the body of the self in the present, and so on. Quite interesting, the conclusion to that was exactly Locke's conclusion. And that is that it was not for. So really, those court cases are quite interesting, involving flashbacks. Within psychiatry, the attitude, at least amongst people involved with who were traumatologists, I won't say who were just involved in treating, who were traumatologists, was a commitment to the idea of flashbacks. Because flashbacks were the ultimate vindication of the validity of the diagnostic classification of an individual who is not only remembering what happened, because memory is something very subjective. All we know about memory is what people tell us about their memories, but rather someone who is actually reliving the event. So flashbacks were very important for traumatologists as well as for some patients. In fact, the validity of flashback, are there really flashbacks in this classical sense that are described, is highly, highly contentious. And if I can put my 2 cents in, from everything that I know about it, and speaking to clinicians and watching patients over a period of 2 years, I think it's a highly, highly dubious notion. And when in court it had to be debated between expert witnesses, the courts decided in favor of the dubiousness of the flashback, and it was not even regarded as a mitigating circumstance. So that's my answer to the question. But again, there's a very great literature, and I certainly, if anything that I've said about Lifton's writing, particularly the Nazi doctors, sounds even a little bit interesting to you, you really should get a copy of the book and read through it. It's a marvelous book, a very, very interesting book. A lot of things that you might want to disagree with, I would want to disagree with, but that does not in any way diminish his enormous achievement in writing that book and everything he had to do to get to the point where he could write that book. That is, through Hiroshima, through Vietnam, and then back to the Holocaust. Okay. Now, in the time that, we have half it. We're here till 12, right? Okay. So that is good. It's good because we have emotions to talk about. Emotions are enormously important. Don't misunderstand me. When you come to the conclusion, I've said to you, we've got half an hour left. That's enough to do emotions. To the contrary, emotions are enormously important. I'll give you 2 points why they're important. Then I'll talk about the emotions. When we talk about the Enlightenment, this period of Locke and Hume and Kant and all the other people associated with it, very often what happens if it's on the TV or it's a potted lecture, it always say, the age of what? The age of anxiety, that's the 1930s and 40s, maybe our own age, the age of narcissism, and so on and so forth. How about this age from Locke and Hume and Rousseau and all these other guys? Always people say, well, we all know what that is. That's the age of reason. And then you get the impression that these guys are all living somewhere in cloud cuckoo land, and they believe that it is the mind is essentially a kind of a computer, which I've got some colleagues who do believe that the mind is a kind of computer running on this sort of logic and so on and so forth. Well, they never believed that at all. They were extremely worldly people, beginning with Descartes, who had been a soldier fighting in Flanders on the Spanish side against the Protestants, and had seen a lot of terrible things. And Hume likewise was, these are very worldly people. And when Hume came to the issue of the emotions, he did not use the word the emotion, he used the word passions. But by passions, we use that in a much narrower sense today. He used it in a broad sense that we use the word emotions. And the question was posed to him, what is the relationship between reason, that is logical inference on the one hand, and emotion on the other hand? And it's quite interesting because I think much of the mischief and misunderstanding of the relationship between reason and emotion was the work of anthropologists. People like Clifford Geertz, who said in our society, meaning Western society, a division is made between reason on the one hand and emotion on the other hand, between rationality and irrationality. Rationality, good; irrationality, bad, evil. That sort of that dichotomy that we're very familiar with. Again, if you go back to the most important sources that we have for the sources of the self, the book Sources of the Self? It's a wonderful book written by McGill's most distinguished philosopher, Charles Taylor, about 15 years ago, published. And the title tells you what the book is about. It's about the sources of the self. Going back to the early church, because he's talking about the self in the West and so on and so forth, in this regard. But if you go back to these people who really are for us talking about psychiatry now, the founding ancestors of the whatever self that we have, our own understanding of the self, these 5 different kinds of the self, they did not make that distinction. They did not say, well, there's reason on the one hand and there's emotion on the other hand, and that the civilized man is someone who struggles to repress the emotion so that he can think reasonably. Hume was the best person to talk about. Hume says, how can you even say that? I mean, that is to presume that when we do think and that we do behave, that somehow ideas move each other, that somehow everything is moving along in this way, the way a computer would. He said, no, there's got to be something else that moves the mind, that moves action, that moves reason. And what that something else is, he said, well, and then he has this very, very famous phrase he used. He says, reason is the slave of the passions. And to say that it's the slave of the passions is that we are driven, our lives are driven by emotion. That's what propels us forward to do everything that we do. And that reason is serving the emotions, not something that's opposed to the emotions, but it is the slave, you don't like slave, you can say servant, of the emotions. So that's number one, that if we're talking about mind, we're talking about reason, we're talking about moral accountability, there's no way that that can be dissociated also from emotion. But if that argument doesn't appeal to you, and say, no, I don't like all this philosophy stuff, it's enough with Hume today. Look at psychiatry and take one document. That document is DSM-4. And leaf through DSM-4. Leaf through the diagnostic classifications and eliminate from all of them emotion. Now, in doing that, it's not only the word emotion there, you have to eliminate the word affect as well. What you will succeed in doing is eviscerating about 7/8 of all the diagnostic classifications, because emotions, pathological and normal and normative emotions, permeates the psychiatric classifications. The psychiatry is all about emotion. And that, I know there are people who say, well, that's not true. How about schizophrenia? I mean, schizophrenia is all about thought disorders. Well, it's not all about thought disorders. It's about more than that. And one of the most disturbing aspects of schizophrenia for clinicians, to work with some people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, is that they are affectless. That is, there's an absence of emotion, of expressed motion in their exchanges, and that these exchanges are very, very disquieting, of talking to someone, interacting someone in which all of the emotion, all of the affect is out of it. It's profoundly disturbing and profoundly pathological. And it's pathological because the elimination. So your example of schizophrenia and thought disorders is a terrible example. It's a vindication of exactly what I'm saying, and that is the idea that emotion goes through the whole thing. Then you say, well, I have an example you overlooked. You overlooked. Okay, it's not psychiatry, it's true, but it's your own lecture, Professor Young. It was yesterday. And when you were talking about Dentstil, and Dent Collective, and you were talking about science. I thought about that. Was very good. I liked that lecture, but one thing you left out, and that is the one thing that makes a scientific, or of science, a Dentstil unique and unlike any more, is that it's all about reason and nothing about emotion. So that's the way it proceeds, and that's really what makes science special. You think so? I suggest you go back and read Ludwig Fleck. And Fleck has a whole section, not a chapter, but a whole section on this, writing as a scientist. And he says, a lot of people have this idea. This is a very common idea. A lot of scientists sometimes have the idea. He said, it is completely mistaken. He said, what makes science, if one can talk about a distinctive Dentstil associated with science, or at least with regards to sciences, it's not the absence of emotion, it is a distinctively shared emotion that is ignored. That is to say, that is part of the background, that no one ever talks about, that everybody takes for granted with regards to it. So that scientific reasoning is not the absence or the purging of emotion, but rather it is the socialization of a distinctive kind of emotion in this regard. So see the exception that you brought up? It's not a good exception. Emotion is there, it's pervasive, it's important to us, And you already know this. Okay, I have a very easy job to do it at this point with doing you. I'm sure everybody is getting a little tired with regards to it. And I want to just make 2 points. Point number one is that when we talk about emotions or the emotions, we're never talking about the emotions because there are different kinds of emotions. Again, I don't know if I didn't use, did I use the phrase family resemblances yesterday? No? Okay, I won't go over it again. But when we talk about the emotions, we assume that somehow this represents a unified field. But it doesn't represent a unified field. There are different kinds, different classes of emotions, different systems of emotions, not only in terms of the body and in terms of the brain. So I wanted to identify 3 kinds of emotions that are important for us in cultural psychiatry. And we could go beyond those and talk about others as well, but in cultural psychiatry that are important. And once I just mentioned them very, very quickly, I want to go on to my 4th subject, well, 2nd subject. First subject, how many kinds of emotions are there? Theories of, styles of emotion are there, number 1. And number 2, are there culture-specific emotions? And that's been a big deal within cultural psychiatry from the very beginning. Okay, number 1, how many different kinds, categories, classifications of emotion are there? I think meaningfully for us in cultural psychiatry, there are 3. The first of these are the so-called basic emotions. And it's quite interesting. I've been talking about this for a very, very long time. And I would never have thought of using the adjective so-called until really the last 2 or 3 years with developments in neuroscience and the emergence of what's called the social brain that have challenged the idea that there are, in fact, basic emotions. But in any event, we still talk in terms of basic emotions. It's become a subject of great, great contention. I will set those arguments aside. It take a very, very long time to talk about, and I'll just describe what the basic emotions are. And I think that you already know that they conform to the idea of basic emotions really begins, most important source, with Charles Darwin, who wrote a book on emotions in relation to man and animals. And it's a wonderful book, absolutely terrific book. I think that Darwin was a very good writer. And if you think it would be a very dull subject, it is not. I know you're busy people, you don't have time to read the book, but go to the book and look at the pictures. And the pictures are the most interesting of all. And what the pictures are very domestic pictures. And many of them are pages of photographs, 2 rows of photographs. In one row is Darwin's son, and he's about 2 years old, dressed like a little girl, which was the fashion in those days. And going down the other side is Darwin's dog. What Darwin is doing is comparing the basic emotions in both his son, pre-linguistic, doesn't have language yet, and the dog. And he's making the argument that there are certain emotions that are identifiable because they are facial emotions. And another term for the basic emotions are the facial emotions that involve involuntary muscles, facial muscles, that are shared by almost all mammalian species, and certainly of dogs, who are not closely related to us at all, and humans. And one can see these basic emotions being expressed in the dog and in the baby, and we know that they're the same emotion because they involve the same involuntary muscles that are, and he goes through each of the muscles. There have been previous research by a French psychologist, Duchenne, that are very, so it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And also, I don't know if that Darwin does this or it's Duchenne. The French were very interested in the theater, in having a pedagogy of the theater, how to teach actors to be actors. Books were published detailing how actors should guide their facial expressions to project emotions into the audience. And they're very amusing to see, because they're not photographs of the actors, but they're drawings, frontal drawings of the face involving the eyebrows and the mouth and so on and so forth. And in the book, he makes the point, however, there are some emotions that you cannot affect, and what they involve, and I think that there are suborbital muscles that are involuntary, so that they appear in basic emotions, and not even an actor can fake them. But since you're not so close to the people and got all the makeup on, don't worry. But Darwin's book is a continuation of that. And again, it's one, and if that's all that you read, and you don't get to the social brain circa 2005-10, it is overwhelmingly convincing. And the person who picked this up most importantly was Paul Ekman. And Paul Ekman's an American cultural psychologist, and he got it into his head that one way in which one could test the basic emotion thesis is to photograph faces of people expressing the basic emotions, and then take them to other societies, to other cultures, and say, look at this person. Tell me in your own language, what is going on here? What is he feeling? You know, blah, 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 that sort of thing. And in one of his most celebrated cases, he took the photographs to a very remote area of the Markham Highlands in New Guinea. And say, well, these people had no contact with outsiders until 10 years ago during the war. So that they're the best we're going to get, and people have not been exposed to other faces, only to each other's face. Let's see if they can identify it. And Ekman then goes on to claim, yes, they do it. They do it. They've got a word for each of these basic emotions. Vindication of everything that Darwin said, vindication of what I've said. Turns out that that this technique ends up being very, very contentious as to whether it would work, whether you can take this because one thing that he does, it's interesting for us to think of this, that he does, he has a photograph, and it's a photograph like this, really from the top of the collarbone to the top of the head, so you can see the face. And you say, well, what else do you need? If you were going to ask people about a facial expression, you want to give them a good picture. Other cultural psychologists have said, wait a minute, let's do another test. Let us do this with Americans, and we can show them the face, and they get everything right. Fear, anger, joy, curiosity, with regards to what they're looking at. And now let's move back. Same face, same person, same photograph, except don't crop it here. Move back so that they are in a situation in which the expression's being shown. So one of the photographs involves someone who's in the middle of, I think, the Republican National Convention, and people all around him. And what is utterly amusing, very, very funny about it is that one's interpretation of the face completely changes as to what's going on once one sees it in the context of other faces and in the context of blah, blah, blah. So the argument is, sure, you can show this to guys somewhere in Highland, New Guinea, but it's thoroughly decontextualized. It's decontextualized, and we don't know what their answers mean. Okay. That's part of the criticism. There are other criticisms too, but let's stick with it and do it very quickly. And the rule is 7 plus or minus 2. That is to say, some people say there are 5 basic emotions, some people say there are 9 basic emotions, and in between you have people saying there. And here you see what they are. The 5 for sure that everyone agrees on until very, very recently are fear, anger, sadness, happiness, and disgust. And if you see the research on the social brain, I'm talking about neuroscience research, they have focused exactly on these. Well, not exactly on all these, but on fear and disgust. And there's a huge neuroscience literature on it, and so on and so forth. Other candidates, blah, blah, blah. Well, you can read this through yourself. What is down here? And the question is then, well, how about all the other emotions that we have? And the argument is, well, the basic emotions are basic not only in being biologically programmed and evolved emotions, but they're the building blocks for all the other emotions. So people talk about generalizing emotions. Again, I'll let you read. You can see what the formula is. And I regret that we don't have more time to go into more detail, but we don't. We spoke about other things that were interesting. Number 2 are the clinical emotions. And the clinical emotions include some of the basic emotions, particularly fear, anxiety, and so on, but also with regards to others, there's qualities of affect and somatization, alexithymia. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This was a thesis within cultural psychiatry that at one time was very, very popular. And the thesis was that people who live in tribal and traditional societies cannot think mindfully. They cannot think in terms of mind and in terms of psychological processes. And because of that, they can't engage one another in terms of a self-conscious understanding of what an emotion is. And so what they do is that they express emotions that we express verbally and express in the form of facial emotions. They express them through the body. And this is the somatization thesis. Alexithymia means they don't have a word for it, therefore it cannot be part of their expressive repertoire. But being more primitive in terms of their intellectual development, they do express it in terms of somatic symptoms, and that's why when you go to a non-Western society, you can expect lots of physical complaints. Don't take them all seriously. A lot of them are simply idioms of distress that cannot be acted out in a way that we self-conscious Westerners can act things out. Well, today, for a long time actually, has been regarded as utter malarkey. It's not true. It's not true, number one, that people in non-Western societies don't recognize emotions. It cannot act them out. And it's even more important in the assumption that somatization is not a conspicuous feature in the West. So, but it's nice to know, it's important to know what this thesis is, the somatization thesis, and its connection with alexithymia. Would be lex, word, thymia, emotion, absence of word for emotion. Finally are the emotions of moral assessment. And they are set off in another group. And this is extremely interesting. And in the book that I wrote about PTSD, The Harmony of Illusions, I have a whole chapter on this. And it's about the psychiatric unit where I did my research, and I made the argument that one way that one could understand about everyday life in this inpatient unit was in terms of a clinical economy with regards to trauma and treatment and blah, 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 blah. But that really didn't describe what was going on. What really described what was going on was that these individuals, the patients and the clinicians, were joined together in a moral economy. and it was a moral economy of the emotions that I've discussed. And in an economy, just the way we talk about any other economy, in which you can bank, you can save, you can have runs on the bank, you can have bankruptcy, and so on. In terms of the four moral emotions, anger, guilt, shame, and shamelessness. Again, there's simply no time to talk about it. Maybe you'll get some idea just by looking at it, or if you want to look at my book and see the discussion. I want to move on now to the question, are there culturally specific emotions? And I know you're thinking, Professor, no, you're a lunatic. What are you talking about? You've got about 2 minutes left, and you've got all of the text. Not to worry. Because I think that if you were willing to spend 5 minutes just reading what's down here, it'll be very, very obvious of the point that I'm getting at. I think it's a really good outline, by the way, that everything is here and should be very, very useful. In fact, if we had not limitless amount of time, but more time, what I would ask you to do is to go back home or to your room, wherever you are, and this evening spend half an hour looking at what's here and thinking about it, and coming in the next day. I'm not going to say anything. You'll do all the talking, because it should be obvious what is going on there. Forget about the transactional emotion. And okay, there are other things here that use this as a kind of reference, I think, rather than for me to go into it. Okay, so by this time, I'm running out of air, or whatever else it is. It was a great pleasure, again, as I said yesterday, and I thank you for your patience and your attention.